In part 1, we saw how the history of capitalism is a history of major booms and disastrous crashes. None shaped the modern world more than the Great Depression of the 1930s, which has its echoes in the crisis of today. We also saw how the state-funded policies of the post-war period created a very different kind of society, as the era of the welfare state was born. But all that was to change with the rise of neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s. So what happened? How did our rulers return to the austerity measures of the 30s? And what are the solutions to a system in crisis? From the 1960s, there were labour shortages in Europe and the United States, and many workers were well organised, exerting political pressure through trade unions.
And that puts a squeeze on the competitiveness of many capitalist industries. It puts a squeeze on profits. And I think that reaches a crisis point in the Western capitalist economies in the 1970s, and in particular in the weaker of those Western capitalist economies which are struggling to compete and to keep their place in the world, of which Britain is a very clear example, because Britain has been in decline relative to other developing economies really since the end of the 19th century.
The rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s reversed the IMF's policies. To counter labour shortages and the strength of organised workers, governments encouraged immigration or outsourcing. The first neoliberal state was effectively created in 1973 following a military coup in Chile which brought General Augusto Pinochet to power. The coup was backed by the CIA and engineered by economists from the pro-free market Chicago School in the United States. Under the new IMF loan terms, deficit-funded spending was replaced by austerity measures, a combination of cuts, financial deregulation and market liberalisation. By the 1980s, the neoliberal project had been cemented, with the IMF's austerity measures at its heart. Neoliberals like Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States launched attacks on organised labour.
Many of the things we hold dear are threatened as never before, but none has yet been lost. So stay here. Stay and help us defeat socialism.
Thatcher represents the reaction, I think, on the part of the rich, on the part of the corporations, to that squeeze on competitiveness, to that squeeze on profits, and represents the counter-attack which is going to drive back the workers, drive back the unions, shift wealth from wages, both the wages in people's pockets and the social wage represented by the welfare state, to shift it back to private capital.
The crisis, when it came, threatened a total system failure. This was only averted by a massive series of bank bailouts delivered by central government with taxpayers' money. For all the survival of the fittest ideology of free market capitalism, a new and surprising piece of terminology emerged. Following the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, certain banks and institutions were now deemed too big to fail.
The US government had already been quietly trying to get liquidity, to get funds into the financial system. It realised there was a serious problem brewing. From certainly by late 2007, it had become clear. I mean, in this country, you'd already had the bank run on Northern Rock, which had already failed. So it was becoming clear something big was going on. The US government on the other side of the Atlantic had tried to contain this with a series of sort of implicit guarantees for banks. They arranged a merger with another failing bank, was Bear Stearns. They'd kind of fused a couple together. They'd kind of, they'd been working away to try and contain the crisis. But the costs of doing this were actually increasing for the government. I think it's a combination of error and failed negotiations, and I think also a kind of slightly mad belief that if we just call a halt to this, we can end the whole thing and you know, we'll allow the free market to let rip, and it will reset the system for us and everything will emerge fine. Now the problem with the idea that you can just let the free market determine which banks succeed and which banks fail is that banks are, this is the meaning of too big to fail, they are systemically important, they matter to the whole system. If a major bank collapses, it's not just like a car manufacturer, a big car manufacturer goes bust. Sure, there's large effects elsewhere. Lots of people lose their jobs, suppliers go out of business, but it's sort of containable. If it's a bank, then it's absolutely everything is suddenly threatened because the system's very, very highly connected. All the banks are very, very densely related to each other. They all lend money and borrow money from each other. They all lend money and borrow money to their millions of customers. It's hugely important. So if one fails, it threatens the entire system, which is of course what happened when Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008. There was a meeting in the Treasury just the weekend after Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, back in September 2008, where Alistair Darling, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, has a meeting with the heads of the major British banks and some Treasury officials, and the heads of the banks basically say to him, if you don't bail us out, if you don't try and deal with this problem, on Monday morning, meeting is taking place Sunday evening, Monday morning we'll have to close all our branches and shut down the cash machines, because they thought they were just going to run out of money. So that's how serious the crisis was by that point. The kind of financial system was tottering.
The bailouts caused Western governments to ramp up huge budget deficits, increasing the gap between borrowing and spending. Meanwhile, public spending was cut radically.
If there is a risk that a government, like Greece, for instance, which is the most likely candidate for this, can't pay its debt, then the creditors also take a hit. So what you get is crisis in private finance, an attempt to deal with it through the bailouts and through deficit spending over here. That turns into a crisis of public debt, but because the public debt is itself held on the credit side back in the private financial system, the crisis feeds back into private finance. And what's happening inside Europe now, as a result of Greece and the other kind of peripheral European countries, so Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and the debt problems they have, is that the European financial system is getting extremely nervous, the banks aren't lending properly, potentially lending is seizing up, and that in turn is threatening a worse financial crisis somewhere down the line.
But for Angela Knight, head of the British Bankers Association, there is no such thing as too big to fail, for Britain at least.
We've been very committed to saying, look, you've got to address banks just like any other company, and that is when they get into difficulties, if they do get into difficulties, then you've got to have mechanisms there which the banks themselves employ to get out of those difficulties, and if they can't, then you've got to be able to wind them down without the involvement of the taxpayers, as we saw had happened in the crisis. Other actions have been taken here, such as some of those international standards for increasing capital, which are set for 2019. We've already done some of those other ones, which are about holding more liquidity, more cash, we've more or less done. So we've just done a whole lot on the stability side, and culturally, as well as from a legal and regulatory perspective, we say there isn't such a thing as too big to fail anymore.
Despite the BBA's insistence that too big to fail and bailouts are for Britain a thing of the past, according to the National Audit Office, the UK Treasury retains the unquantifiable ultimate risk of supporting banks should they threaten the stability of the overall financial system again. UK taxpayers are liable for any further bank failures up to a total of £1.3 trillion.
Governments have to stabilise the banking system in order to underpin the capital position of banks in the event of future losses.
You talk about banks being shored up, having these extra liquidity, extra capital. Surely that's a bailout in waiting, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's not something that you've got from the public sector. It's extra capital and liquidity that the banks have raised themselves. What the industry has always said is that the capital rules are, and I know it's an odd word, pro-cyclical. Now, what that means is that what the rules are forcing you to do is build up capital in the difficult times, and then you can use it in the good. What, in fact, you should be doing is building up capital in the good times, and then you can use it in the bad. Right now, the requirement is, irrespective of what you or I may think, on the industry to build up more capital and more liquidity now. And the reason that it is because authorities consider that there could well be another real problem arising out of, and the obvious one, is the lack of resolution in the Eurozone.
You talk about shoring up banks in the good times as opposed to the bad.
It's not shoring up. Shoring up implies something else.
But it implies that that money is there in case there's another crisis.
No, it isn't actually. The real point of the capital and liquidity rules is in order to hold reserves for your customers getting into failure. It's the writing off of debts. We've got to get some balance. I mean, you can't spend somebody else's money forever, can you? Those countries who are not seen as acting properly are in much worse difficulty. Look at Greece's credit rating at the moment. They've not seen to have acted properly. And therefore, for them, it means that markets are closed and they, as a country and a government, have to be bailed out by others. And we've got some other countries in Europe where the view is they haven't done enough. In the UK, fortunately, this government has done enough.
The BBA appeared to be against the prospect of any future bailout of British banks. So I asked them what they thought of the UK coalition government's decision to bail out the Republic of Ireland in 2010. A spokesperson told me that this was not a bailout, but a loan, though didn't explain the difference between the two. If Angela Knight represents a defence of the current system as it is, Famida B. of Norton Rose advocates the moral restraint of the Islamic financial model.
We're going to look inside a commercial bank and learn how banks serve us. We'll find out how Nancy Wallace is helping herself and helping the bank to fulfill its purposes.
The practice of usury, the charging of interest on borrowed money, is prohibited in many religions. The Torah states that, "Thou shalt not lend upon interest to thy brother," and the Bible that, "The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender." In contrast, as capitalism developed, interest became increasingly integral to the continuous hunt for profit. Banks became inseparably linked to capitalist enterprises, leading to the rise of what is known as finance capital.
Well, one of the fundamental differences between an Islamic financial system and a conventional financial system as it's practiced today is that interest is generally prohibited, all forms of interest in the Islamic system. So I can't lend you money, I can't lend you £100 today and get back 110 at the end of the year. We have to do something with £100 which generates a profit, which then sort of allows me to pay you back your original investment plus the 10 that I've generated by using the 100 that you've given me. We can get together and buy a property and then rent it out, and that can be your share of the profits. We can go out and buy a commodity, we can buy some coffee beans or something and sell them to a coffee shop and make a profit. We have to do something that is real and meaningful. Now, I guess the reality is that the way Islamic finance is being practiced in some parts of the economy is that we use that requirement for real transactions and use them to, in some ways, replicate the conventional ways of getting funding. And that's one of the criticisms that's levelled at Islamic finance, that the transactions that I describe as real transactions are not at the heart of what's being done, but they're simply being done in order to create a loan-like relationship. But that's not the way Islamic finance is meant to be practiced. It's meant to be practiced with a real relationship, real assets, and fundamentally a real sharing of profit and loss between people who are bringing together money on the one hand, skills on the other, or an asset on the other, and the two put together create something that benefits the economy and society as a whole.
And why do they invest their dimes and dollars? They want to make a profit. It is a normal, wholesome motivation.
Dr. Gaines, I once heard a clergyman say that the profit motive is not a good motive.
Do you agree with him?
Some of the causes of the financial crisis that we're currently seeing would not have been permitted in a system that was Sharia compliant, particularly in that period from September 2008 when Lehman's collapsed to about the beginning of January 2009. There was a view that Islamic finance had completely separated from the conventional markets. It was doing perfectly well, and it was a model of how things should be run, and the conventional model had completely failed at that point. From January onwards, we saw the impact of the real credit crunch that followed the financial crisis. And I think there was a recognition at that point that Islamic finance wasn't big enough, wasn't strong enough to separate from the conventional system. It was very dependent on it. You could imagine a system which had nothing to do with CDOs, a purely Islamic system where people were investing in property on the one hand, perhaps in shares of compliant companies in the other. We saw significant falls in the prices of all of those. So I don't think we can say that if you had a purely Islamic system, you wouldn't have boom and bust anymore. What you probably wouldn't have is the level of failure that we've got at the moment.
If we don't deal with our debts in Britain, then there will be no growth, no jobs, people won't invest in our country. Britain has to confront its problems. That is the clear message from the rating agency today. And that is a reality check to the entire political system that Britain cannot duck dealing with its debt problem.
With Europe in crisis, city streets were filled with resistance to austerity measures. On the 15th of October in the UK, following an attempt to occupy the London Stock Exchange, protesters camped out at the foot of St Paul's Cathedral. It was part of a global day of over 900 occupations in cities across the world. Meanwhile, the government of Italy collapsed to be replaced by an unelected government of technocrats, and the Greek government voted to do the same. In Athens, Madrid, Rome, London and beyond, masses of protesters engaged in demonstrations, strikes and riots. Britain saw a student revolt, experienced an historic trade union demonstration and later a mass strike.
They say come back! We say fight back!
All day, all week, Occupy Wall Street!
In the US, in September 2011, activists descended on Zuccotti Park, Manhattan. They sought to combine the occupation of Egypt's Tahrir Square with the anti-capitalist politics of the Indignados movement in Spain. The occupation soon went global. With even conservative estimates predicting a lost decade of austerity, analysts continue to debate the full scale of the crisis and what the future holds.
Can it all happen again? Well, first of all, every country's got to take the real sort of stability steps, more capital, more liquidity, sort out the debts that are there within their financial centre if the debts are too great. And it's also got to sort out their economies. And sorting out their economies often means you can't spend so much and you've got to be more competitive.
This isn't a crisis of public spending. The financial crisis, the crisis inside the Eurozone, did not happen because countries spent too much money on public services. That just isn't the case. I mean, Greece is a very good example of this. Greece spent less than the European average on its public services during the time it was a Euro member. It spent less than Germany, for example. It's just not true to say they all spent too much money, that's why you have a crisis, that's why we have to cut spending. So it's misdiagnosed. If you, as the government, cut your spending, that means that firms are selling less because there's less demand in the economy. If firms are selling less, they cut their wages to their own workers, they try and cut their costs elsewhere, they make redundancies, they may even go bankrupt, go out of business. But if firms are selling less and then cutting wages, making redundancies, that means everybody else has less money. So they in turn spend less. And if they're all spending less, that means firms sell even less, and you get a nasty, vicious circle. It's happening very dramatically in Greece at the moment. The Greek economy has shrunk by about 20% over the last 4 or 5 years. So it's lost a fifth of its value because of the deep recession there. And the more that austerity is applied, the worse that gets. And the more the economy shrinks, the worse the debt problem becomes. So at the start of the kind of Greek debt crisis, which is the end of 2009, the ratio of Greek debt to its GDP, to its national income, to the amount of money it made in a year, was 130%. So it was debt was about 30% bigger than the entire value of the Greek economy for a year. You then get 2 years and a bit of austerity, of attempts to cut public spending in order to repay the debt, that actually just undermines the entire economy, that produces a very dramatic recession. So it's now on about 160% of debt to GDP. So in other words, the debt is much bigger relative to the size of the economy than it was at the start of the process. So if you say you want to repay the debt, you want to get rid of the debt, and you want to do this by cutting public spending and prioritising repaying the debt, what you actually do is undermine the economy that is supposed to be paying for the debt. And because you're undermining that economy, the debt becomes relatively worse. Now, the deal that was agreed, the one that David Cameron famously walked out of just before Christmas in 2011, tries to write this mechanism into law. So instead of just being a choice by governments that, okay, we think the best way out of this crisis is to cut public spending, that's what the UK government says, that seems to have become the pattern across Europe. It says that we will make it legally binding on any government that no matter what they may think, the law will say you have to act in this way in order to try and get out of a debt crisis, which is ludicrous because it basically just enshrines this mechanism of decline in law. So it's damaging for democracy because clearly governments should be elected and free to choose what they do, and it's economically just suicidal because you're hardwiring this kind of process of recession into every decision a government will make over its economic policies.
John Maynard Keynes, who is, of course, the great liberal economist who's shaped by the experience of the Great Depression, he argues, on the basis of the experience of the Great Depression, that you don't worry about the debts in a crisis. What you do is you worry about the unemployed, you get people back to work by investing, and then the debts will take care of themselves. And that's because, of course, once you get people working, earning wages, paying taxes, the economy growing, there's a multiplier effect, and we all begin to move forwards, and the debts become manageable. And that was all part of a kind of response, really, a kind of liberal economic response to the crisis of the 1930s. But of course, what it did was, in a very significant way, it shifted politics to the left. And it created a kind of consensus around the idea there is a society, we do care about each other, we do have responsibilities to each other. It's not a kind of jungle where everybody eats everybody else, everybody's competing with everybody else. It is a place where we create public services like the National Health Service, where the service is delivered at the point of need, at the moment of need, free of charge. Now, that cuts against the whole neoliberal idea that actually, if you can't afford to pay for your healthcare, you shouldn't get it, and the whole thing should be run on market principles. So I think the reluctance on the part of our political leaders to embrace a radical alternative to the crisis is bound up with their sense of the political dangers.
This programme has raised questions not often asked in the mainstream media. Who will pay for the biggest crisis since the 30s? Was excessive government spending to blame, or is more spending in fact the answer? And can the current system be run on a moral basis, or is more radical change needed?